Welcome to Dead Good Stories. We have some disturbing and scary horror stories to help you sleep tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe. Otherwise, lie back, relax, and let sleep consume you. Samantha had always loved old things, antiques, heirlooms, objects with history and character. One afternoon, she stumbled upon a quaint, dimly lit antique shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of town. The shelves were cluttered with oddities, dusty clocks, tarnished silverware, and faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow you as you passed. But it was the dollhouse that caught her attention. Tucked in the back, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket, stood a stunning Victorian dollhouse, its paint chipped with age, yet still beautiful. The craftsmanship was remarkable. It wasn't just a dollhouse. It was an exact replica of her childhood home. Every window, every door, even the garden outside mirrored the house she had grown up in. Samantha's heart raced with a strange sense of familiarity and nostalgia. Though it unnerved her slightly, she felt an irresistible pull to own it. Without hesitation, she purchased the dollhouse and brought it back to her apartment. After placing it on her dresser, she examined it closely, her fingers tracing the delicate woodwork. The tiny furnishings were meticulously placed, each room fully furnished as if someone had carefully curated the entire house. There was even a miniature version of the oak tree in the backyard where she used to play as a child. The more she looked, the more she marveled at the eerie level of detail. But it wasn't until nightfall that the dollhouse began to take on a life of its own. The first night was quiet, but the next morning Samantha noticed something strange. A book she had left on the kitchen table the night before was now on the floor, pages splayed open. She dismissed it as absent-mindedness. But over the next few days, more items in her house began to shift. Keys would be in different places, chairs slightly moved, lights left on when she was sure she had turned them off. The odd disturbances grew more frequent, yet subtle enough that she questioned her memory. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she began to pay closer attention to the dollhouse. It became a nightly ritual to check it, as though something was compelling her to look inside. One evening she noticed something even stranger. The tiny front door of the dollhouse was ajar. She was sure it had been closed when she brought it home. As her fingers nudged the miniature door open, a shiver ran down her spine. She peered inside, her breath catching in her throat. Inside the dollhouse, in the living room, was a tiny figure seated on the couch. It wasn't just any doll, it looked exactly like her. The figure wore the same clothes she had been wearing that day, its posture an eerie mimicry of how she had sat on her own couch earlier. Shocked, Samantha stumbled back, her skin crawling. She convinced herself it was a coincidence, maybe just a trick of the mind. Yet the unease lingered like a dark cloud. That night her sleep was restless. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with images of her childhood home, but distorted, its hallways too long, the windows too small, as if the walls were slowly closing in on her. She woke in a cold sweat, instinctively turning her gaze toward the dollhouse. Its tiny windows seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, like the eyes of something watching her. Over the next few days, the dollhouse's interior seemed to change. Objects inside it moved on their own, reflecting changes in her real-life apartment. One morning, Samantha noticed the miniature kitchen in the dollhouse had a chair knocked over. When she checked her own kitchen, she found the same chair lying on the floor, just as it appeared in the dollhouse. The sense of dread grew. She began to avoid the dollhouse, covering it with a sheet, hoping to escape the growing unease. But that night she heard faint noises coming from her dresser, like tiny footsteps shuffling across the wood. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she peeled back the sheet, and her blood ran cold. The tiny version of herself was now standing at the front door of the dollhouse as if ready to leave. And it wasn't alone. There were other figures inside now, her family, her mother, her father, even her childhood dog, all positioned around the dollhouse, going about their routines in eerie silence. It was as though the dollhouse was alive, a mirror of her past life, replaying itself over and over. The next morning, Samantha tried to destroy the dollhouse. She threw it to the ground, smashed it with a hammer, and even tried burning it. But no matter what she did, it remained intact. The dollhouse seemed indestructible, as though it was bound to her in some sinister way. Exhausted and terrified, she collapsed onto her bed, hoping that when she woke up, this nightmare would end. But when she awoke, everything had changed. The ceiling above her seemed lower, the bed larger, the walls closing in. Samantha shot up, panic flooding her veins. She wasn't in her bedroom anymore. She was inside the dollhouse. The bed, the furniture, the walls, they were all miniature versions, and she was trapped, small and powerless. Through the tiny window, she saw a figure standing in her real apartment, gazing down at the dollhouse. It was her, an exact version of herself, smiling eerily. The figure reached out and gently closed the tiny front door, locking Samantha inside. As the door clicked shut, the realization hit her like a wave of ice. She wasn't the owner of the dollhouse anymore. She was its prisoner. And whatever was out there, living her life, was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in the shadows, watching her through the dollhouse all along. John had always preferred the solitude of nighttime, the stillness of the roads after dark, the empty streets bathed in the glow of streetlights. It was a kind of peace he found comforting. That's why he enjoyed his late-night job as a rideshare driver. He rarely had to deal with crowds, and the passengers he picked up at night were often too tired to chat. They'd climb into the back seat, give him an address, and then sink into silence. It was perfect for him. One particular night, around 2 a.m., he received a ping from a remote area just outside of town. It was a stretch of road he wasn't familiar with, but his GPS directed him through winding streets that led him farther and farther from any sign of life. The houses thinned out, replaced by trees and fields that stretched into the darkness. As he approached the pickup location, he saw a woman standing on the side of the road, her figure illuminated only by his headlights. She was wearing a long, flowing dress, its fabric pale and ethereal in the dim light. Her hair was dark and hung loose around her face, obscuring her features. There was something unsettling about the way she stood there, motionless, as though she had been waiting for him for hours. But John was used to odd passengers. People came from all walks of life, especially late at night. He pulled over, and she silently got into the back seat. John asked for her destination, and she quietly gave him an address in a flat, emotionless voice. He nodded, inputting the location into his GPS. As he drove, the car was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the tires rolling over the deserted road. The woman didn't speak, and John didn't push for conversation. He was used to passengers like her, the ones who preferred silence over small talk, but something about this ride felt different. About 10 minutes into the trip, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere inside the car felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very air around him had thickened. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, but he resisted the urge to turn around. He focused on the road, trying to ignore the nagging sense of unease that was creeping up on him. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, the surrounding landscape becoming more desolate. Trees loomed on either side of the road, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows under the moonlight. The GPS estimated another 20 minutes to the destination, but every minute felt longer, stretched by the uncomfortable silence that filled the car. Unable to resist any longer, John glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to catch a glimpse of his silent passenger. But when his eyes met the mirror, his blood ran cold. The back seat was empty. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickly scanned the mirror again, his eyes darting between the road and the back seat. The woman was gone, yet he hadn't stopped the car. There had been no sound of a door opening, no rustling of fabric, nothing to indicate she had left. Confusion and fear clawed at him, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. He pulled the car to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He turned around, his eyes scanning the back seat, but it was completely empty. No sign of the woman, no trace that anyone had ever been there. John sat there for a moment, his pulse racing, trying to steady his breathing. He checked his phone, unsure of what to do next, when it pinged with a notification from the rideshare app. It read, "Passenger dropped off." The words sent a chill down his spine. How could she have been dropped off when she had disappeared right before his eyes? He stared at the address listed next to the notification, his heart pounding even harder. It was his own home. Panic surged through him, and he immediately restarted the car, driving faster than he should on the dark, twisting road. His mind raced with questions. How could the app have sent him his own address? Why had the woman vanished? His thoughts spiraled into a storm of confusion and fear as he sped toward his house, unable to shake the dread growing inside him. When he finally reached his street, everything looked normal. The familiar sight of his home, nestled at the end of the cul-de-sac, should have been comforting, but tonight it filled him with an overwhelming sense of foreboding. He parked the car in the driveway, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the door handle. Stepping out into the cool night air, he scanned the area, half expecting to see the woman standing somewhere in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet suburban neighborhood bathed in moonlight. John approached his front door cautiously, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence of the night. The closer he got to the door, the heavier the air seemed to grow, thick with a feeling of something unnatural, something wrong. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the doorknob, but before he could turn it, he froze. Standing in the middle of the driveway was the woman. She hadn't been there a moment ago, but now she stood perfectly still, her face still hidden by her dark hair, her long dress flowing eerily in the windless night. John's breath caught in his throat as she slowly lifted her head, revealing her face for the first time. His blood ran cold. The woman's face wasn't just familiar, it was his wife's. His wife who had died 3 years ago in a car accident on a night just like this one. Her eyes, hollow and lifeless, stared at him, her lips curving into a faint, unnatural smile. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet as the realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He staggered back, his mind reeling, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. His wife, who had been gone for years, was standing before him, unchanged, as though she had stepped out of the grave and into the night. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about her presence. She wasn't the woman he remembered. The warmth and life were gone, replaced by something cold, something otherworldly. John's mind raced, trying to understand how this was possible. Had the woman he picked up been some kind of ghost, a spirit leading him back to this twisted encounter? As he stood there, frozen in place, the air grew colder and the shadows seemed to lengthen around him, as if the night itself was closing in. He realized then that this wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning. When Emily and Mark first laid eyes on the house, they knew it was perfect. It was a charming 2-story home nestled on a quiet street, shaded by large oak trees and surrounded by a well-kept yard. The house had a warm, inviting character, with its old wooden floors and spacious rooms bathed in sunlight. It had been on the market for a while, and the price was shockingly low for such a large house. But they didn't question it. They felt like they had found a hidden gem. After a few months of settling in, they decided to explore the attic. Emily had always been drawn to the idea of an attic space, somewhere she could turn into a studio for her painting. The attic, they discovered, was larger than expected, but as they moved through it, something strange happened. At the far end, behind a pile of dusty old furniture, they found a door. This door hadn't been on the floor plan. It was small and nondescript, blending into the wall in a way that made it easy to overlook. Neither Emily nor Mark had noticed it before, and it wasn't mentioned in any of the documents they had received when they purchased the house. Curious, they exchanged glances and decided to open it. Behind the door was a small room. It was musty and filled with dust as if it had been sealed for years. The room was square, with bare wooden floors and old peeling wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There were no windows, just a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Despite its age and neglected appearance, the room felt strangely intact, as though it had been preserved for some unknown reason. Emily, ever the artist, immediately saw potential. She imagined it as a private space for her to work on her paintings. The quiet, enclosed atmosphere appealed to her sense of solitude, and she decided that this hidden room would become her studio. Mark wasn't as sure. There was something about the room that unsettled him, but he shrugged it off, thinking he was just being paranoid. Over the next few weeks, Emily spent more and more time in the room. She brought in her easel, canvases, and paints, transforming the space into a creative haven. But as she worked, she began to notice an unsettling feeling. Every time she stepped into the room, the air felt heavier, colder, despite the fact that it was summer. It was as if the room had its own atmosphere, separate from the rest of the house. Strange occurrences started happening. Paints would be knocked over when she was certain she had placed them securely. Brushes would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. At first, Emily brushed it off as her own absent-mindedness. She was the type to get lost in her work, to forget where she had left things. But soon, the disturbances became harder to ignore. One evening, while she was finishing a painting, she heard a soft, persistent whisper. It was faint, just at the edge of hearing, and seemed to come from the walls themselves. She paused, listening intently, but the whispering stopped as soon as she paid attention. Shaking it off, she resumed painting, but the uneasy feeling in the back of her mind wouldn't go away. It felt as though someone, or something, was watching her. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's unease grew. She began to feel a presence in the room, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her whenever she was inside. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing stifling. No matter how much she tried to dismiss the feeling, it gnawed at her, making her increasingly uneasy. The whispering, too, became more frequent, growing louder and more insistent. At night she would lie awake, hearing the soft murmur echoing through the house, always seeming to come from the hidden room. One afternoon, while cleaning the room, Emily discovered something unsettling. As she moved an old, dusty trunk from the corner, she found a loose floorboard. Curious, she pried it up and discovered a small compartment beneath. Inside was an old leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. The name Anna was written on the first page, in neat, looping handwriting. Flipping through the diary, Emily realized it belonged to a girl who had lived in the house many decades ago. The entries started innocently enough, detailing Anna's daily life, her family, the house, and her longing for a room of her own. But as Emily read on, the entries became darker. Anna wrote about strange occurrences in the house, about hearing voices in the walls and feeling like she was being watched. She spoke of a mysterious room that her parents were building for her, a room that wasn't on any of the house's original plans. The last entry chilled Emily to the bone. "They're building a room for me, but it's not to live in." After reading the diary, Emily felt a deep sense of dread. The room she had been using as a studio, it was the same room Anna had written about, the room that wasn't supposed to exist. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that the diary was just the ramblings of a young girl's imagination. But the growing sense of wrongness in the house became impossible to ignore. That night, Emily told Mark about the diary and her experiences in the room. He listened, concerned, but tried to reassure her that it was just an old, forgotten room, nothing more. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next morning, Emily went back to the attic to check the room, but when she reached the spot where the door had been, it was gone. The wall was smooth, with no sign that a door had ever existed. She searched frantically, pulling furniture aside, feeling along the walls, but there was no trace of the room. It had vanished without a trace. Panic set in as she ran downstairs to find Mark, but when she called for him, the house was silent. There was no response. She searched every room, every hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, but Mark was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished, just like the room. Desperate and terrified, Emily returned to the attic, hoping to find some clue, but all she found was his wedding ring, lying on the floor where the door to the hidden room had once been. The silence in the house was deafening, and the oppressive weight she had felt in the room seemed to have spread throughout the entire house, suffocating her. As Emily stood there, clutching the ring in her trembling hands, she realized the truth. The room hadn't just vanished. It had taken Mark with it, just as it had taken Anna all those years ago. The house had been hiding its secrets, waiting for the right moment to claim another soul. And now, it had claimed her husband. The house was no longer the warm, inviting home they had once loved. It was a prison, its walls closing in, trapping her in its eerie silence. The room that wasn't there had never truly disappeared. It was still watching, waiting, just beyond the walls, and Emily knew that it wouldn't be long before it came for her, too. Sarah had always been captivated by music. Growing up, the sound of melodies drifting through the house had been a constant in her life. Her mother had been a talented pianist, and some of Sarah's fondest memories were of listening to her play in the quiet of the afternoon, sunlight filtering through the windows as her fingers danced across the keys. But those days were long gone. Her mother had passed away when Sarah was a teenager, leaving behind the piano and an empty house filled with memories. When Sarah moved into her own place years later, she inherited the piano. It was an old, grand instrument made of dark wood that had been polished to a shine over the years. Despite its age, it still played beautifully, the keys smooth under her fingertips. To Sarah, it was more than just an instrument. It was a connection to her past, to the mother she had lost. She placed the piano in the living room of her new house, a cozy but somewhat isolated cottage on the outskirts of town. It was perfect for her. Quiet, peaceful, a place where she could focus on her work and unwind. The house had a certain charm, with its large windows and overgrown garden, though it felt a little too quiet at times. But Sarah didn't mind. She liked the solitude. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. Sarah would spend her evenings playing the piano, letting the familiar notes wash over her as she remembered her mother's favorite pieces. The house, though old and creaky, felt like home. But then, things started to change. It began subtly at first. One evening, after a long day at work, Sarah sat down at the piano as she always did. As she played, she noticed a faint sound in the background. It was so soft that she almost didn't register it at first, like a distant echo of the music she was playing. She paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped. Shrugging it off, she resumed playing, thinking it was just her imagination. But the sound returned the next night, and this time, it was unmistakable. It wasn't just an echo. It was another melody entirely, faint and ghostly, like someone was playing along with her from another room. Sarah's fingers faltered on the keys as she stopped, turning her head to listen. The melody continued for a few moments before fading away into silence. Unease crept into her as she sat there in the quiet room, staring at the piano. She told herself it must have been something outside, a car passing by, or the wind playing tricks on her ears. But deep down she knew that wasn't the case. There was something about the sound, something too familiar. It reminded her of her mother's playing. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Every time Sarah sat down to play, the ghostly melody would return, growing louder and more insistent. It followed her around the house, no longer confined to the piano. At night, when she lay in bed, she could hear the faint sound of keys being pressed in the living room. The notes were slow, deliberate, as though someone was sitting at the piano, playing in the dark. The sound unnerved her, but she tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the old house was just settling, or the piano strings were loose and vibrating on their own. But as the days went on, Sarah began to notice other things. Objects in the house would move slightly, nothing dramatic, just little things, like a picture frame being tilted or a book shifting on the shelf. She would walk into the room and find the piano bench pulled out as if someone had been sitting there, though she knew she had pushed it in. One evening, Sarah decided to record herself playing, hoping to capture the strange melody that seemed to accompany her. She set up her phone on the mantel, sat down at the piano, and played a simple, familiar piece her mother had loved. As she played, the ghostly melody returned, weaving in and out of the notes she was striking. Her heart raced as she continued, determined to get through the piece. The melody grew louder, almost overwhelming her own playing, until finally she couldn't take it anymore and stopped. She grabbed her phone and played back the recording. The room was silent for the first few seconds, just the sound of her playing filling the air. But then, just as she had heard while playing, the other melody began. It was faint but unmistakable, the notes rising and falling in a way that sent chills down her spine. Sarah listened in growing horror as the melody continued even after she had stopped playing, lingering for a few seconds before fading into nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the phone, her mind racing. This wasn't just her imagination. Something was playing along with her, something she couldn't see. The thought terrified her, but a small part of her wondered if it could be her mother's spirit, somehow still connected to the piano. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The sound of the piano keys echoed in her mind, and she kept imagining someone sitting at the instrument, playing in the darkness. She tossed and turned, trying to convince herself that there was a logical explanation for what she had heard. But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. The next day, Sarah decided to leave the piano untouched. She didn't want to provoke whatever was happening. But that evening, as she sat in the living room reading, she heard the unmistakable sound of the piano playing again. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was clear and loud, as if someone was sitting at the bench playing the very piece she had played the night before. Her blood ran cold as she stood up, her eyes fixed on the piano. The bench was pulled out, but no one was sitting there. Yet the keys were moving, pressing down on their own, playing the haunting melody that had been following her for days. Sarah backed away slowly, her heart racing, unable to tear her eyes away from the sight. The music filled the room, wrapping around her like a shroud. Terrified, she fled to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The music continued to play, echoing through the house, relentless and unending. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it seemed to seep through the very walls. As the night wore on, the music finally stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Sarah lay in bed, her heart pounding, too afraid to move. The house felt different now, as though the very air had changed. The once cozy cottage had become a place of fear and dread. The next morning, Sarah decided she couldn't stay any longer. She packed her things hurriedly, avoiding the piano at all costs. The house felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to sit down at the piano again to play the notes that would summon the melody once more. She had no intention of doing so. She needed to leave, to escape whatever was haunting her and the instrument. As she closed the door behind her and drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the piano, with its haunting melody, would always be there, waiting for her return. And deep down, she knew that no matter how far she went, the music would follow her, echoing in her mind, a melody that refused to be forgotten. David had always been drawn to the strange and unusual. As a collector of antiques and oddities, his home was filled with items that told stories. Each piece had its own history, its own secrets. He loved the thrill of finding something unique, something that had been forgotten by time. So, when he stumbled upon the old curio shop in the back streets of the city, he couldn't resist stepping inside. The shop was cramped and dimly lit, with shelves overflowing with strange trinkets and artifacts. The air smelled of dust and age, and the only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. David wandered through the clutter, his eyes scanning the shelves for something that would catch his interest. That's when he saw it, a mask. It was hanging on the wall at the back of the shop, partially obscured by other items. The mask was made of some kind of dark, weathered wood, and it had a haunting, almost lifelike quality to it. The face it depicted was unsettling, a human face, but twisted in a way that made it look like it was caught in a scream or a moment of intense pain. The eyes were hollow, and the mouth was open, as if frozen mid-scream. Despite its disturbing appearance, David was captivated by it. He asked the shopkeeper about the mask, but the old man was vague, muttering something about it being an old ceremonial piece from a long-forgotten culture. The shopkeeper seemed hesitant to sell it, but David's curiosity was piqued. He had to have it. After some negotiation, the mask was his. Back at home, David hung the mask on the wall of his study, where it seemed to command the room. He couldn't stop staring at it. The longer he looked, the more it seemed to change. At times, the expression on the mask seemed to shift. One moment, it looked like a face in pain. The next, it seemed almost peaceful. But there was always something deeply unsettling about it. He couldn't explain why, but the mask made him uneasy. That night, David had trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mask. It was burned into his mind, the hollow eyes and twisted mouth haunting him. He tossed and turned, trying to push the image away, but it stayed with him, vivid and real. When he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with strange, dark visions. Faces like the one on the mask, twisted and screaming, surrounding him. Over the next few days, David noticed odd things happening around the house. Small objects would move from where he had left them. Doors that had been closed would be found open, and he began hearing faint whispers in the quiet of the night. At first, he chalked it up to his imagination, the result of overthinking the strange mask. But the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. One evening, as David was reading in his study, he felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature in the room seemed to drop dramatically, and he shivered, pulling his sweater tighter around him. He glanced up at the mask, which seemed different somehow. The expression had changed again. This time it looked almost angry, the eyes narrowing, the mouth twisted into a snarl. A sense of dread washed over him, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from it. That night, the whispers became louder. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the house. David lay in bed, frozen, as the voices surrounded him, speaking in a language he didn't understand. He tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that it was stress or exhaustion, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The mask seemed to take on a life of its own. Every time David looked at it, the expression was different, more twisted, more sinister. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching him, waiting. He began to dread going into the study, but at the same time, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the mask, as if it was calling to him. One night, as he sat in his study, staring at the mask, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. This time, they seemed to come from the mask itself. The hollow eyes seemed to bore into him, and the mouth, frozen in that twisted, screaming expression, seemed to move, just slightly, as though it was trying to speak. David's heart raced as he watched, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could feel a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. The mask had begun to invade his life. The strange occurrences grew more intense. Objects in the house would fly off shelves or fall to the floor without explanation. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, just out of sight, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, the whispers would grow louder until they were almost deafening. David could no longer sleep, the sense of dread keeping him awake. Desperate, he tried to get rid of the mask. He took it down from the wall and placed it in a box, intending to throw it away. But no matter what he did, the mask would always reappear. He would find it back on the wall, hanging in its usual spot, or sometimes even closer, propped up against a chair or sitting on his desk, as if mocking him. It was as though the mask had become a part of the house, or worse, a part of him. David's life began to unravel. He became consumed by the mask, unable to focus on anything else. His work suffered, his friends stopped visiting, and he rarely left the house. The whispers became a constant presence, always in the background, always there, gnawing at his sanity. He started to see things, figures moving in the shadows, faces in the mirrors, all with the same twisted, agonized expressions as the mask. One night, after weeks of torment, David reached his breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore. The mask had to be destroyed. In a frenzy, he grabbed the mask and took it to the fireplace, determined to burn it. He threw it into the flames, watching as the fire licked at the wood. For a moment he thought it was over, but as the flames grew higher, the mask did not burn. Instead, it seemed to glow, the wood taking on an unnatural, almost lifelike sheen. The hollow eyes seemed to fill with something dark and malevolent, and the mouth, still twisted in that terrible scream, seemed to open wider, as if it were trying to swallow the fire itself. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and David felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. Suddenly, the fire went out, leaving the room in darkness. The mask sat in the fireplace, untouched, unburned, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. David stumbled back, his heart racing, realizing that the mask could not be destroyed. It was too late. Whatever power the mask held, it had already taken hold of him. From that night on, David was never the same. The mask remained on the wall, its expression changing, always watching, always waiting. The whispers never stopped, filling the house with their eerie, unintelligible chorus. David became a shell of his former self, haunted by the mask and the malevolent presence it had brought into his life. The house, once a place of solace and curiosity, had become a prison, and the mask, with its hollow eyes and twisted mouth, was his jailer. He could feel it, watching him, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing day. David had become its latest victim, and he knew that, like all the others before him, there was no escape. The mask had chosen him, and it would never let him go.